Sean, one of the things that I often hear in churches and when apologists speak is that the disciples would have never died for a lie, for something they just made up. But is that really true? I mean, don't people die for lies all the time? I mean, don't we see that, with terrorists at times, or with various groups die for a lie? Cults at times die. People in the cults will die for something they believe is true, or something maybe even somebody in the cult made up.
So when we talk about the death or the fate of the apostles, this is tied to the resurrection, since they were the first eyewitnesses, and they spent time with Jesus and claimed to see him alive. The question is, did they really die for this, or did they make up the story? Well, whether they died for their beliefs doesn't prove it's true, but it shows the sincerity of their beliefs. It shows the depth of how much they believed it. Now the response would be, well, so what? Modern day terrorists really believe it, so the apostles. Well, the difference a lot of people miss is this. Is the apostles, so if I die for my belief, we walk outside and someone says, are you a Christian? If so, I'm going to shoot you, and I say yes. What does that prove? That doesn't prove anything about Christianity being true. That only proves that I believe it. But my beliefs are based on, number one, my experience with God, but second, what I have heard second, third, fourth hand, what I've heard passed down from others. So my death wouldn't prove Christianity is true, it would only prove that I believe it. The apostles were eyewitnesses. None of the Muslim terrorists who died for Islam were eyewitnesses of Muhammad raising from the dead.
That's right. They
weren't witnesses of him doing any miracles. They all heard about this, centuries removed. The apostles were eyewitnesses. It tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that he appeared to the 12, which would have been the 11 without Judas, of course. Appears to James, appears to Paul. So if they didn't die for what they heard secondhand, they died for what they saw with their own eyes. So again, this doesn't prove that it's true. But if we're trying to ask, can we believe what these men write to us? I don't know what else they could do to show their sincerity. It was Blaise Pascal who said, I prefer those witnesses who get their throats cut. So they didn't die for something they heard secondhand. They were all, now I would say as far as the evidence,
let me kind of frame this, because some skeptics are going to respond to this at this point and say, but how do we really know that they actually died? How do we actually know that? It's one thing, okay, that makes sense, but what evidence do we have that they died?
Great question. Well, here's what we do know. We know for sure that to believe in Jesus was to believe in the resurrection. We know Christians were being persecuted early on. We see this. We know that the apostles were willing from the beginning of Acts. They were thrown in prison, they were threatened, and they were beaten. And in Acts 5, they're told, just stop talking about Jesus, and if you do, we'll let you live. In Acts 5:29, Peter says, we can't. We fear God more than we fear men. So we know they were all willing to suffer and die. Now, when you look at the 12 apostles, I studied the 12 apostles and then James and also Paul. The evidence for some of the apostles varies. So the evidence for the death of Peter, death of Paul, both James, I think is about as strong as you can get historically. When you get to people like Simon the Zealot, it's hard to know what is history and what is legend. But what we don't have is we have no record of any of the apostles recanting their beliefs. And you better believe, when we come to the 2nd, 3rd century and some Christians folded under pressure, if there was any evidence that apostle did, they would have dug that up and said, wait a minute, James did this. Wait a minute, Simon the Zealot did this, and they don't. So that silence is actually pretty powerful. But take Peter, for example. We actually have evidence from Peter in the Gospel of John. Towards the end in chapter 20 or 21, Jesus is speaking to Peter, and he says, you'll be taken where you not want to go. Your hands will be tied. And then the writer John says, Jesus said this to him, describing how he would be killed. But then you fast forward, we have Clement of Rome in the end of the 1st century. You have writers like Ignatius in the early 2nd century. You have writings like the Ascension of Isaiah, the Apocalypse of Peter. All these 2nd, 3rd century writings tell a consistent story that Peter was martyred, and I think probably crucified in Rome during the time of Nero. So historically we know that. And there's evidence for some of the other ones, but I think the general case is we know they're all willing to suffer and die. There's no evidence that any of them recanted or folded. And we have good historical evidence that quite a few of them really, in fact, did die as martyrs for their faith.
Yeah, so one of the things you learn from this, just taking a step back about apologetics, is you want to be careful. You know, we want to be careful about our sources. We don't want to claim too much. And Sean's showing that in what he's explaining, because he's saying, okay, these are the disciples, for instance, Peter, that we know more about. But there's some we don't, and we need to be careful with that.
That's right.
Because we don't want to make arguments that are going to come back to haunt us. We don't want to make bad arguments. And so one of the things we can learn, even from engaging unbelievers, is sometimes maybe our arguments are not very good, and we need to think through that. We need to be careful, and sometimes we can make a poor argument, and that doesn't mean the whole house of cards falls down. It means that
I think that's
we
right.
need to rework maybe what we're thinking and what we're saying.
And you know what? Just do your homework.
Yeah.
If you're an apologist, I mean, I've made this mistake. I hear somebody else say something, so I just repeat it, and I don't check my sources. If anybody should check their sources, it should be a Christian. We should care about truth. And then when we don't, and we make an argument and we can't back it up, it undermines the gospel even worse. So do your homework.
Yeah, absolutely.